How Sugar Changed the World, Part 1. Imagine holding a spoonful of sugar. White, ordinary, almost invisible in its familiarity. Yet that tiny crystal is a fragment of one of the most powerful forces in human history. Sugar has shaped empires, fueled revolutions, financed slavery, and transformed diets, economies, and even our idea of pleasure. It is hard to believe that something so simple, so sweet, could have such a bitter past, but sugar truly changed the world. Our story begins, not in Europe, but far to the east in the humid fields of ancient India, more than 2,000 years ago. Early Sanskrit texts from around 500 BCE mention a mysterious sweet substance extracted from reeds, sharkara, which is actually the root of the English word sugar. Indians had discovered how to extract juice from sugarcane, boil it, and crystallize it into small, transportable lumps. Before this, sweetness was a luxury that came only from fruits or honey, fragile, seasonal, and rare. Sugar was the first concentrated sweetness humans could store, carry, and trade. By the 4th century CE, sugar making had become an art in India. The process involved cutting cane, pressing it to extract juice, clarifying it, and then heating it in stages until crystals formed. When Persian armies under King Darius and later Alexander the Great reached India, they marveled at what they called the reed that gives honey without bees. Persian and Greek records tell of this wonder, a plant whose juice could turn to solid sweetness. The knowledge of sugar processing began to travel west. The next great leap came with the Arabs. After the 7th century, as Islam spread across the Middle East and North Africa, Arab traders carried with them not just goods, but technologies among them, sugar cultivation. The Arabs refined sugar making into a sophisticated science, building mills and irrigation systems that transformed landscapes. By the 8th century, sugarcane was growing in Persia, Egypt, and even parts of North Africa and Spain. In Arabic, sugar was called as sukar, from which we get the word sugar itself. It was used in medicine, cooking, and even perfumery. Physicians such as Avicenna described its properties in medical texts. Apothecaries sold it as a healing powder. In Islamic cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo, sugar became a symbol of refinement, part of an urban culture that prized sweetness and sophistication. But sugar was still an elite product. It was rare, expensive, and transported over long distances. To produce it required intense labor, careful irrigation, and plenty of heat. In the 10th and 11th centuries, the Arabs introduced sugarcane to Sicily, Cyprus, and Crete islands that combined sunlight, water, and access to Mediterranean trade. These were Europe's first sugar fields, though the technology remained mostly in Muslim hands. Europe, meanwhile, had only a vague awareness of sugar. For most medieval Europeans, sweet meant honey. Only through contact with the Islamic world during the Crusades, for example, did knights and merchants encounter sugar. Crusaders returning from the Holy Land in the 11th and 12th centuries brought stories of a miraculous spice sweeter than anything in Christendom. At that time, sugar was sold in apothecaries, measured by the gram, and prescribed as a medicine. It was known as white gold, even before that phrase became cliché. By the 13th century, Venice had become the main European hub for sugar imports. The Venetians traded with Muslim ports and refined raw sugar into the small loaves known as sugar loaves. These were wrapped in paper and sold to the wealthy. Sugar appeared on the tables of princes and popes, used in candy, spiced wine, and elaborate desserts, but its price remained astronomical. In the 14th and 15th centuries, European hunger for sweetness grew rapidly. As cities flourished and trade expanded, the demand for luxury goods, silk, spices, and sugar increased. But Europe's own lands could not produce enough sugarcane. The plant needed tropical sun and abundant water. The Mediterranean islands, once rich in sugar fields, were overworked and small. To feed its growing appetite, Europe needed new lands. At this moment, in the late 15th century, two forces collided: exploration and sugar. When Portuguese and Spanish sailors set out into the Atlantic, They were not only seeking gold and glory, they were searching for profitable crops to justify their risky voyages. Sugar was at the top of their list. The Portuguese, under Prince Henry the Navigator, experimented with sugar cultivation on islands off the African coast Madeira, the Azores, São Tomé, and Cape Verde. These islands became laboratories for a new kind of agriculture. Large plantations, worked not by free farmers but by enslaved laborers brought from Africa. Here, in the Atlantic sugar islands of the 15th century, the modern sugar economy was born, and with it, one of the darkest chapters in human history. How Sugar Changed the World, Part 2. When Christopher Columbus set sail across the Atlantic in 1492, sugarcane was already aboard his ships. It was not gold or silver he carried in his pockets, but cuttings of a tropical grass, a plant that would soon cover half the Caribbean. Columbus introduced sugarcane to Hispaniola, modern-day Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. The climate proved perfect. Sun, rain, and fertile soil worked their magic, and within a generation, the Caribbean was transformed into a vast engine of sweetness and suffering. The 16th century saw the birth of what historians call the sugar complex. It was a system that joined continents in a brutal triangle: Europe, Africa, and the Americas. European investors financed plantations in the New World. African captives were transported across the Atlantic to work them, and the sugar they produced was shipped back to Europe to sweeten the tables of the wealthy and eventually the poor. In Brazil, the Portuguese built the first great sugar empire. By the mid-1500s, the northeast coast Pernambuco and Bahia was lined with engenhos, sugar mills, powered by water wheels and enslaved human labor. Jesuit missionaries wrote of fields white as snow when the cane flowered, and of nights lit red by the fires of boiling houses where juice was turned to syrup and crystal. Brazil exported thousands of tons of sugar every year, feeding a European craving that seemed impossible to satisfy. But sugar was not only an agricultural product, it was a financial revolution. It required enormous investment: land, machinery, ships, and, tragically, people. To keep the plantations running, European traders began importing enslaved Africans on a massive scale. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, more than 12 million Africans were forced across the Atlantic, and the majority were sent to work on sugar plantations in Brazil, the Caribbean, and the American South. The human cost was staggering. Enslaved men and women were forced to labor under a burning sun, cutting cane with machetes from dawn to dusk, their lives often shortened to a few brutal years. The sweetness that filled European cups of tea and coffee was extracted from unimaginable suffering. By the 17th century, sugar had transformed global trade. The Caribbean islands, Barbados, Jamaica, and Saint Domingue, today's Haiti, became some of the most profitable territories on Earth. A single acre of sugarcane could earn more than any European farm. Wealth poured into the ports of London, Bristol, and Nantes. Sugar taxes built palaces and funded navies. The phrase white gold became literal. Sugar was the new currency of empire. In England, sugar consumption skyrocketed. In 1650, the average person consumed almost none. By 1800, it was nearly 18 pounds per year. Tea, coffee, chocolate, and rum, all bitter without sugar, became everyday comforts. The modern idea of sweet pleasure was born. What had once been a luxury for kings turned into a habit for the working class. And as demand rose, so did the machinery of empire. The British, French, Spanish, and Dutch all fought bloody wars over sugar islands. The 7 Years' War, 1756–1763, sometimes called the First Global War, was driven as much by the sugar trade as by any political ambition. When the British captured Guadeloupe and Martinique, they debated whether to keep those tiny islands or the vast territory of Canada. Some argued that the sugar islands were worth more than an entire continent. Sugar reshaped landscapes too. Forests were cleared, rivers diverted, and indigenous peoples displaced. The Caribbean, once lush with biodiversity, became a checkerboard of cane fields and mills. The very air smelled of molasses and smoke. Travelers described the islands as beautiful from afar but hellish up close. A paradise for the master, a purgatory for the overseer, and a hell for the slave. But out of that, hell came revolutions. In 1791, enslaved people in the French colony of Saint-Domingue rose up against their masters, launching what would become the Haitian Revolution. It was the only successful slave revolt in history and led to the creation of the first Black Republic in 1804. The world's richest sugar colony had turned against its oppressors, and the shockwaves spread across the Atlantic. The revolution terrified European powers. Plantation owners fled to Louisiana and Cuba, carrying with them both sugarcane and their brutal system of labor. Within a few decades, Cuba had replaced Haiti as the world's leading sugar producer. Sugar always found new soil, new victims, new profits. Meanwhile, in Europe, sugar was feeding the Industrial Revolution. The wealth it generated financed factories, banks, and the very cities that would later consume refined sweets on a mass scale. Sugar was energy not only in the body but in the economy. It fueled workers, powered machines, and sweetened the daily life of the new industrial classes. By the early 19th century, the world was hooked on sugar. It was in tea, rum, jam, and pastries in every corner of modern life. But a quiet revolution was about to take place, one that would change sugar once again and free it, at least partially, from its bloody origins. How sugar changed the world. Part 3. By the dawn of the 19th century, Europe's appetite for sugar had become unstoppable, but the world that supplied it was changing fast. The Haitian Revolution had shattered France's richest colony. Britain had begun its long, painful process of abolishing the slave trade, and on the European continent, new ideas about science and industry were taking root. Out of this mix of war, innovation, and necessity came the next chapter in sugar's global story: the birth of beet sugar. In 1747, a German chemist named Andreas Marggraf discovered that ordinary beets contained a form of sugar chemically identical to that of cane. His findings were interesting but impractical. No one imagined turning beets into a commercial source of sweetness when tropical cane plantations dominated the market. But half a century later, Europe found itself at war with the very regions that supplied its sugar. When Napoleon Bonaparte faced the British blockade in the early 1800s, he needed to make France self-sufficient. In 1811, he offered prizes and subsidies for the cultivation of sugar beets and the construction of refineries. Within a few years, more than 300 factories dotted the French countryside. The first successful beet sugar production began around 1812, the same year that Napoleon's armies marched into Russia. Though his empire collapsed, his sugar experiment survived. Beet sugar was slower to spread than cane, but it had one great advantage. It could be grown in temperate climates. Germany, France, Russia, and later the United States began to cultivate it on a massive scale. By the late 19th century, beet sugar accounted for nearly half the world's production. The age of tropical exclusivity was over. This technological revolution coincided with moral change. Across Europe and the Americas, the abolitionist movement was gaining strength. Britain outlawed the slave trade in 1807 and slavery itself in 1833. France followed in 1848. The Caribbean plantations, once engines of unimaginable wealth, began to decline. Many former colonies tried to adapt by hiring indentured laborers from India and China, a new form of exploitation, but the global sugar economy had shifted permanently. Meanwhile, sugar had become woven into the fabric of modern life. In the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution turned sugar from a luxury into a staple. Refineries were built next to ports and railways. Machines churned out polished white crystals by the ton. For the first time in history, ordinary workers could afford sweetness daily in tea, biscuits, candies, and soft drinks. Sugar also began to fuel another, quieter transformation: the industrial diet. Factories produced sweetened foods that provided cheap calories to urban populations. In Britain, workers consumed sugary tea and jam as an energy source during long shifts. Sugar, in a way, became the fuel of industrial capitalism. It kept laborers working and profits flowing. But this sweetness had consequences. Doctors noticed rising cases of tooth decay, diabetes, and obesity ailments that were once rare. As early as the mid-19th century, reformers like William Cobbett warned that the new white comfort of sugar was both a blessing and a poison, yet no one could resist it. Sugar was addictive not in the chemical sense we use today, but in its deep hold on culture, comfort, and emotion. By the early 20th century, sugar was everywhere, in breakfast cereals, soft drinks, chocolates, and preserved fruits. It symbolized prosperity, childhood, and love. Advertisers sold it as healthful energy. Governments taxed it as easy revenue. Wars were fought over it again. During both world wars, sugar was rationed, reminding people just how central it had become to modern life. If you trace the history of sugar, you trace the history of globalization itself. The plant that began in the fields of ancient India became the engine of empires, the justification for slavery, the foundation of fortunes, and finally, the invisible ingredient in nearly every meal. Few substances have traveled so far, touched so many, or revealed so much about humanity's hunger, not just for taste, but for power and pleasure. Today, we are still living in the world that sugar built. Our global food industry, our energy-dense diets, our struggles with health and inequality all carry echoes of that first sweet crystal. When we pour sugar into our coffee or open a can of soda, we are participating in a story that began thousands of years ago with a reed that made honey without bees. And perhaps that is sugar's final lesson. Every technology of pleasure carries a cost. Sweetness can lift the spirit, but it can also enslave through labor, through addiction, through desire itself. Sugar changed the world because it revealed something profound about us: our endless pursuit of comfort and our willingness to reshape the planet to taste it. From the temples of ancient India to the mills of the Caribbean, from the laboratories of Paris to the factories of modern America, sugar has been more than food, it has been history, crystallized.